And the FBI search is, of course, underway from the Navy Yard shooting suspect. We're looking at every part of his past, not only here but also abroad. And joining us live now is former Special Agent in charge, Lauren Anderson from the FBI. And obviously this is something you're familiar with, not necessarily this specific shooter. Now, I'm sure you looked into it, but about the process of now going into his past and finding, what led to this, where he may have gotten his information and his background and the weapons and all that, correct?
Absolutely true. Thank you for having me here. I think it's important for people to understand how these investigations progress, because although much of it is laid out in the media, what goes on behind the scenes is not transparent, and It shouldn't be until a certain point in time. So in addition to the obvious look at what's going on in the Navy Yard and the presence of the FBI at the Navy Yard, other FBI field offices around the United States, anywhere that Aaron Alexis has been or lived, those offices have been activated, and the investigators and the analysts in those offices are in the process of finding out everything they can about Aaron Alexis. All of us compartmentalize our lives.
Right.
Aaron Alexis is no different, and that accounts for some of the differences of what we're hearing coming out in the media. He was a great guy. He was an angry guy. He was a good practicing Buddhist. He wasn't. Another component beyond the United States is that the FBI will look at what happened in Thailand. You have a man who has said that he didn't have the resources to sustain himself, was being helped in the Texas Fort Worth area by the Buddhist temple and by others, yet this is a man who was able to afford a ticket to travel to Thailand. So looking at his finances, looking at his phone records, looking at all of his computer activity is an integral part of this, in addition to the interviews that will be conducted.
When looking at that part, as you mentioned, here's a guy who says he doesn't have the money, yet he went to Thailand. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the mental health issue as well. I mean, I've always wondered, how does the FBI, when they do their investigations, and they look into this past, obviously this includes everything from friends, associates, where he went, what he did, but also potentially his situation if he had a mental problem, right?
That's correct. And it's important also, I think, not to rush to judgment as the FBI or any agency goes forward on an investigation like this. The biggest challenge we have, and the greatest risk that there is to stay focused on what the facts that you're developing are telling you and not to leap to conclusions. There are many people in the United States who suffer from insomnia. Mm-hmm. There are many people that have had challenges in their workplace from day to day. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to turn into someone like Aaron Alexis.
Right.
So it's carefully weighing that information as it's developed and really getting a full picture of who Aaron Alexis is. And that's going to take some time. That's not something that's going to be completed by the end of today.
Now, you're obviously retired FBI, but you've been involved in cases before, obviously not exactly similar to this, but cases that I'm sure that are as serious or close to it. When as you mentioned, it doesn't happen fast, and you have to develop this picture. When you first heard, like all of this horrible event take place this week, what thoughts, as a former agent, what thoughts went through your mind, Special Agent in charge? I mean, you obviously already have certain programming and things you're going to think about right away, just like I'm going to think about a certain way being in the news industry or someone who's in the Navy Yard. Everyone's going to have their own thought process. What was yours when this first went down?
Well, the first thought of anybody who's a boss in the FBI is going to be, could there be a potential for terrorism here? Because then, as the leader of an office, you then have to consider what the politics are and who you're going to be hearing from.
Right.
You have to focus the investigators and the analysts on the task at hand, and they are superb at that. They rarely need guidance in that. So they go out and do the job on the ground. But it's important to consider what other things are swirling around out there. Everybody is particularly concerned about terrorism, but it's a mistake to leap to a conclusion and even suppose that this could be the case. Initially, you wonder. I wonder, as anybody would in a situation like that. But what I recognize is that it's important to just sit back and see what develops before rushing to judgment, because it creates a whole nother discussion that probably shouldn't even be being had until we understand what the facts are.
I mean, I guess what's frustrating for a lot of Americans is, these guys who are doing these things, they're bad people. They're evil. I mean, and I guess as a law enforcement agency, especially someone in a Special Agent in charge, you know that evil exists. And the process is having, I guess it's for me, I've always wanted to ask this question. I have friends in the FBI and they're still active, and so I know that they can't always answer the question. But I'm excited to have you on here, because when you have to go back and find this information out, obviously it's incredibly important for future investigations, for future ability to stop people like this. But you're also having to go back and investigate evil. That's got to be tough in a lot of respects, right?
It is. And when you have been through terrorist attacks like many agents and analysts have, it's difficult. You really, as going back to compartmentalizing your life, you have a job to do, you have to stay focused on that, but at the same time, we're human beings, and the humanistic aspect of that has a significant impact. And at that point in time, having healthy relationships with other individuals, having close relationships with family and friends, those are the kinds of things that help balance you in that situation. But it's difficult, and it's important to keep your humanity in this, because keeping humanity is an important part of being an impartial investigator.
It's interesting. I'm looking at some of our as we're talking, some of the people that are listening here on FoxNews.com and some of the comments that are coming in. And, one of the person says, it's how do we count, they asked how we count mass shootings. If you count mass shootings as 4 people, then we have a lot more than we realize. As law enforcement, there's a lot of debates about the guns being the problem. I don't want to make this a gun debate, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are. I mean, is this a society problem? Is this a gun problem? Is this a mental health problem? I mean, is it that easy to put it in one of those 3 columns?
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert on weapons or mental health.
Right.
So let's be clear on that.
Yeah, and neither am I. I want your opinion.
From my experience, though, it is a significant problem. It's a good point that that person raises. And the incidents are counted, certainly by the FBI, but all of the other underlying data goes along with that. So that is there, and it is retrievable. At the same time, the mental health issue or the behavioral issues is something to consider as well. There's been a lot in the press in the last 24 hours, including from the Secretary of Defense, that there were red flags.
Right.
And in fact, there were. But one of the things that I believe marks the federal government's process of going through a security clearance for an individual is its inconsistency. When you go for a secret level security clearance or top secret, as has been laid out before by others ahead of me, there's a very big difference in terms of the depth of investigation that's done. That's an important point. However, where the inconsistency arises is twofold. Number one, oftentimes, with the exception, for example, in the FBI of an agent applicant, the background investigations are contracted out to individuals. Sometimes they're contracted out through companies, as you witness in this instance. Mr. Alexis worked for the experts, and then they had somebody doing the background.
Right.
So there's a very wide disparity in the capabilities and the degree to which those contractors do their job and the degree of diligence. The overwhelming majority are terrific. But I know from even my own experiences, having been interviewed in conjunction with somebody's background reinvestigation, that some are not as thorough as others. That's an important point. The second point where there's inconsistency is when you look at disciplinary actions or behavioral issues in conjunction with security clearance. There's not a consistent policy in place right now across the federal government that says if you have engaged in behavior that brings you to a disciplinary situation, how is that going to be looked at in the context of your suitability to retain a clearance? In the FBI, some years back now, it's been quite a few years now, the FBI made a determination that any employee against whom an allegation was made, regardless of whether it's determined to be true or not, you have a parallel investigation going on concerning the alleged behavior or misconduct. At the same time, our security division is notified. So the minute that beginning starts on the disciplinary side, and this could turn out to be nothing, it could turn out to be unfounded, or it could turn out to be something significant, but the security division is noticed immediately. So they're in a position to track it, and then once the disciplinary portion is completed and comes to its end, the security division then undertakes its own review to assess the suitability of the person to continue to have the kinds of access he or she has within their job.
No, that makes sense. That's actually it's interesting that I didn't realize it even worked that way. That's fantastic, and I look forward to obviously. As you mentioned, this is going to be a long process, and I assume I know that Jonathan will likely have you back on talking about this, because just the background of all this is especially for those of, even in the news industry, we're around law enforcement a lot, but we don't always get the background, because a lot of the folks that we know in law enforcement can give us some stuff, and maybe more after the fact, but when it's actually happening, rightfully so, they can't tell us everything. So it's good information. Really appreciate you having you on. Lauren Anderson, former FBI Special Agent in charge, talking about the investigation of the Navy shooters past, and as we mentioned, it'll be going on for some time.
Thank you very much.